Robots are good at they're not necessarily good at doing things better than humans, but they're good at doing things the same way every time. And that's something that humans struggle with more. So when I get into an internal combustion engine and drive it, only about 22% of the energy that's in that fuel actually makes it to the wheel. But when I'm in an EV, it's 80%. So because EVs are so much more efficient of a use, it just turns out that burning things to move things is just incredibly wasteful. Actually, burning things to make electricity is also incredibly wasteful. We're fighting now for survival. I don't think people have definitely not caught up, by and large, with the state that we're in regarding the climate. This is not a question of whether or not climate change severely impacts our lives and our civilization. It's a question of how bad it gets. We have already passed the point. Nobody is going to avoid the effects of climate change. No one on this earth is going to be spared. There's nowhere you can run and hide.
Carl Jung speaks about how a person's childhood influences their adult life. And it's the same force, the same experiences that push some to change the world. Today's guest, Christian, is a journalist and an energy advisor with Clean Energy Associates, a North American solar solutions provider. Christian grew up in company of nature, and it did not take him long in life to figure out his calling. From fighting illegal logging to policy building towards net zero, Christian's life story is a great learning for all of us. As the world changes and more of us are needed in the race against climate change, we don't have to belong to an industry to belong to an industry. Hop in. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as we did.
To know more about what your background is, how did you get into climate change, how did you get into writing about climate? So we'd love to know more about that.
My journey as a writer is a bit different than my journey as an environmentalist. I would say that my journey as an environmentalist started by being born in Oregon, in the western part of the state, very heavily forested, and being in love with the forests there from as long as I can remember. Basically, some of my first memories are being in those forests. It's a conifer forest, like you have similar to, it's a bit warmer, but it's the same kind of trees as you have in a taiga, where it's basically all, in this case, Douglas fir and western hemlock with some cedars. And that influenced me from a very early age. And I think that I've had environmental inclinations. It has always seemed obvious to me that we are dependent very much on the earth and not on us. But yeah, my journey as a writer was a bit different. I bounced around in my 20s and had a number of careers. I did a lot of blue-collar work, but I had always excelled at writing in school, and I had always wanted to write, and I'd always been inspired by writers. Some of the great minds of European literature and philosophy, and had always read a lot. I come from a family that reads a lot. So I just started writing, and I started writing for underground papers, and then, I did some journalism internships, and I started doing radio reporting. I reported on the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. I did some freelance writing around then too, for various publications. Labor Notes, which is a labor publication. I did some writing for them, and some other leftist publications. Against the Current, I did some pieces for them, and eventually I started to build my career as a radio journalist. But it's a very difficult career in the United States to be a radio journalist. So eventually I went into communications because that paid. And so I worked for a labor union. I worked for American Federation of Teachers in New Orleans in the aftermath of the storm. And I also worked for environmental organizations. And I have to say, I'll come back to that line of environmental work. But while after working for the teachers union, a friend of mine, I was literally unemployed in my living room. I had just gotten done changing the oil on my girlfriend's car, my ex-girlfriend's car, actually. And I was there in coveralls, and a friend came and knocked at the door and said, "Hey, I want you to come work for us." And so he was working in an environmental nonprofit in New Orleans that was focused on a combination of ratepayer advocacy and renewable energy, which was an interesting combination. But they were basically advocating for the people paying electricity bills, but also advocating for more renewable energy. It was called the Alliance for Affordable Energy. It's still around today. And so the Alliance got me introduced to the energy transition and renewable energy, and I was hooked. And after working at the Alliance for a little while, nonprofits are often not very stable as employers. I met a man who had come from Germany to give a tour about Germany's energy policies. And he contacted me and said, hey, I have this friend who is looking for someone to write about solar, as a trade journalist right here. So I went to work and I wrote for about a decade as a trade journalist, writing about this solar and the energy transition. I was very lucky when I went to work for the Alliance for Affordable Energy, because suddenly, for the first time, I wasn't fighting bad things from happening. We were working to get a renewable portfolio standard in Louisiana, a renewable energy mandate. At that time, we were mostly focused on being able to use the sugarcane bagasse from the sugar mills as a source of electricity, because solar was really expensive. And I think I lacked the vision to realize how much cheaper solar was going to get in just a few years, right? But we were suddenly fighting for something. We were fighting for a different kind of future, a future powered by renewable energy, And I think that's what really hooked me, was suddenly I had a chance to articulate a better vision of the future. And that is what guides me in my work today, is this idea that we can actually build a better future for humanity.
Absolutely. I think a lot of what you just told about your life, it means that there was always a calling. There was this calling towards what you're doing now. It just came in different forms and shapes throughout your life. So do you feel that way as well? I mean, from where you grew up to where you are now, do you feel there was this constant calling towards what you're doing right now?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In some ways, I think that I always knew that we had to be doing this. I was kind of waiting for the rest of society to be ready for this change, because I think that we've always kind of known in the West that our lives are unsustainable, and that what we're doing is unsustainable. The way that we live, our consumerism, our particular use of fossil fuels, there's so many things that are just unsustainable. Our society of disposable goods, all of this is unsustainable. It can't continue. But we always put it off into the future, like, oh, well, we'll deal with that later. Oh, it's not, we never prioritized it. And I think eventually it comes around and it comes knocking, and then you need to prioritize it. And so I see this today, and I see the way that the climate movement is obsessed with stopping individual fossil fuel projects. Sometimes it's worth it anyway. Sometimes that fight is worth it anyway, and there are some meaningful things that you can do, like stopping development bank funding. I just had a very interesting argument online with Jonathan Kumi, who's a writer about all of this, and he made some good points. But still, at the end of the day, stopping fossil fuel supply does not get us off fossil fuels. It doesn't. We're trying to stop fossil fuel supply. It's futile. If you want to get off fossil fuels, you have to change the way that we use energy. You have to meet the demand for transportation and electricity and the other services that are part of our civilization with new technologies, which means you have to deploy technologies. And that takes actually building things. You can't just be against things. You have to be for things as well. And that requires more imagination. It requires more from you personally to have a vision of the future and to be for things and to build things. It also requires some flexibility. There are some aspects of the, I know people who get upset about things like lithium mining. I'm sorry, we're going to have to mine a tremendous amount of lithium. And the other viable option besides mining and extracting, or however we get it, a tremendous amount of lithium, is to allow climate change to become much worse. So we really practically, at the end of the day, have two options. And the third, we can use more or less lithium. We can do this more or less intelligently. We can do more recycling. We can do more vehicle miles traveled reduction. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to mine a bunch of lithium. And I'm sorry, if you don't like mining, maybe you just don't like living in industrial civilization, and you should go be a hermit. Because short of that, you're dependent upon mining if you live in modern society. And you should probably get, we can do it better or worse. But to some degree, some of the environmentalists should also just get over it.
You've spoken about some of the steps that the new Biden administration is taking towards taking off fossil fuels consumption. So, would you want to elaborate on that? Because I think that seems like a welcome change.
Yes, absolutely. the Biden administration is not getting sufficient credit for what it's doing. This is the first administration that I can think of that is really responding sufficiently to the climate crisis. There was a start with President Obama, but it was not nearly enough, to be frank. And you know, when we talk about the other administrations, Trump took us actively in the opposite direction. So, you know, and the Bush administration before that, nothing meaningful, right? Very little meaningful. It was almost an accident when they did something good meaningful about the climate. Biden administration is the first presidential administration in my lifetime that has actually responded appropriately to the climate crisis and is actually taking it seriously. And this manifests in what I consider to be a very intelligent and strategic approach of going after the end uses of fossil fuels, which is to me exactly how you win this. You know, specifically, the Biden administration's rules on automobile emissions will shift us to electric vehicles. Frankly, that was happening already, but it gives it certainty and it speeds it up. And it helps us catch up with some of the developments in other parts of the world, like in the European Union and China.
I agree. I mean, you've also mentioned about how IRS offers incentives for manufacturing, developing capability in the US for the supply chain, solar supply chain, which right now majorly is controlled by China and a couple of Southeast Asian countries. So I mean, what's your opinion on when would regional powers, let's say the US, which is the largest installer in the world, India, which is the third, fourth largest installer in the world, have enough local manufacturing capabilities to fulfill their local demand? Because right now, with China supplying almost the entire world's solar, that seems to be a bottleneck.
Yeah, China has, you know what? China, 15 years ago, you know, maybe a little bit more, made some very smart choices about deciding that the future of the world was going to be clean energy, it was going to be renewable energy, and that China should make it and should supply the rest of the world. This coincided nicely with the German feed-in tariff having a huge source of demand, but it was just smart. They made, you know, and China said, we're going to put the resources of the state behind making sure that this industry works and that it happens here and that we make these things. I think for a long time we complained about that. And then the other thing that China did was they stuck with that path. They made that decision and then they stuck with that path and they continued at every level of the government. So if China has the majority of the world's solar manufacturing capacity, if it has the majority of the world's battery manufacturing capacity, it isn't because, you know, for instance, some people would claim it's because they're using slave labor in Xinjiang. No, I'm sorry. This was well before we had problems with forced labor in Xinjiang. China had taken this over because China had decided to do it. And China has a lot of cheap inputs, cheap land, cheap financing, you know, cheap, all of these things that are cheap electricity, a lot of which is made possible by the government, by active intervention to make sure that it happens. So I think what the United States and India have had to decide is, okay, we're going to have to do this too. Because just saying, bad China, you shouldn't support your domestic industries, you're breaking the rules. That isn't working. That didn't work, right? That managed to get us to shut off, oh, okay, great. Well, we can shut off a degree of products directly from China. Now they'll come from Southeast Asia. You know, it's also a bit of whack-a-mole. And it doesn't build anything here domestically, right? So if you want to build things domestically, you need to have industrial policy. For a long time, the United States was very free market. You know, we had this free market orthodoxy. Both parties were behind it. You know, nobody said industrial policy. Nobody even thought about this. We might fund innovation, but that was it. We thought, oh, we'll just out-innovate them. Well, great. Then you start to develop a technology and then they can manufacture it cheaper in China. They go to China. The IP goes to China. It's over. You know, so finally, after a very long time, the U.S. government learned the lesson that we need to actually have industrial policy and we need to actually support these industries, you know, if we want them to happen here. And I think the Indian government has learned the same lesson and I am very impressed with what the Modi administration is doing around clean energy. And I think that, you know, at my work, we look at India as a place where there's potentially a lot of capacity that's going to get built along the value chain.
I mean, BP has said that over the next maybe 10 years, the demand for oil and gas will peak. But having said this, we are still solar is still at about maybe 3%, 3.5% of the total grid globally. And with China controlling, majority of the supply chain for solar, when do you think would solar reach maybe a 10%, 20%, 30% mark of the global grid? because I think that's the day that a lot of energy enthusiasts are really looking forward to. And the day when we can say that solar powers now 20% of the world's energy. So when do you think that will happen?
Well, that's really hard to say. I would like to take your question and modify it a little and ask a slightly different question, which is solar and wind, because there's a lot more wind that's been deployed globally, and the two work well together, and really, then it becomes solar, wind, and batteries. So I've spent most of my career writing about solar, but wind is also extremely important here. And for instance, where I am in New England, offshore wind is even more of a key resource than solar, because if we shift our electricity, if we shift our heating to electric heating, which we need to do, away from, natural gas, and in some cases petroleum, we are going to need more electricity in the winter. And solar is not a good fit for that. Offshore wind is. So, depending on where you are in the world, the mix is going to be different. But I think that I am encouraged by the growth of this portfolio, which is solar, wind, and batteries, because we need all of these pieces, and we're going to need more pieces as it goes along. In terms of when we get there, I actually take those two things about when we get to 20% solar and wind, oil demand peaks. I take those differently, because I see oil demand peaking as being more related to the demand for transportation fuel, right? And I'm actually pretty bullish about that. I don't personally know, but I have, the people who I think really have the best handle on this are saying that it's likely to peak in the next few years, and that, by 2030, it will have plateaued. And I think that there's a good case to be made for that due to the rise of electric vehicles. And electric vehicles in, China is leading. Europe is, Europe and China are leading. The United States is catching up. But I think we're going to see much more rapid growth in the EV market through 2030 than what people expect. Now, in terms of when solar gets up to 20%, I would not be surprised if we get there by 2030. And the reason that I would not be surprised is a lot of people look at this and they say, well, we only deployed, I forget what it is last year, 150 gigawatts of solar globally. Well, we can't get there by deploying 150 gigawatts a year. But the point is, we had to deploy 150 gigawatts last year, 120 the year before that, 100 the year before that. The number increases. So we're dealing with a situation that is similar to exponential growth. I think exponential growth is the mathematical concept most people understand.
You mentioned that by 2030, BP expects the demand to plateau for oil and gas. And one of the contributors towards that would be adoption of EV. I mean, the sooner we move towards EV from petrochemicals, the sooner the curve flattens. But unless there's generation of coming from solar, strong argument that comes here is, are we really moving the emissions from a distributed setup where each vehicle is generating emissions and moving it to a concentrated energy power plant? Because the source of energy continues to be polluting, continues to be emitting those emissions. So without having a clean energy grid, having significant amount of problems solved in solar battery grid, we're just moving the emissions away from the cities to a concentrated power plant.
So I would say we are moving the emissions, but we're also reducing them. Because the truth is that when I get into an internal combustion engine and drive it, only about 22% of the energy that's in that fuel actually makes it to the wheel. But when I'm in an EV, it's 80%. So because EVs are so much more efficient of a use, it just turns out that burning things to move things is just incredibly wasteful. Actually, burning things to make electricity is also incredibly wasteful. Even splitting atoms is wasteful because in all cases here, we get a whole lot of heat. And, getting that into motive power, you end up losing most of its heat, right? So the fact that you're starting with electricity and you're using electricity to move the wheels, you're already at an advantage. So I'd say even if the grid wasn't changing, it would still be an advantage to move to electric vehicles. That being said, the more you clean the grid, the more of an advantage it is. So if you're in football, you don't run to where the ball is, you run to where the ball is going to be. And so we need to ramp deployment of electric vehicles as we clean the grid to get to where we need to be.
Having said this, I think a lot of these jobs of the future will hopefully have robots doing them as well, because the amount of new stuff happening with AI, the amount of new technology coming in robotics, and I've loved robotics throughout my life. I mean, I've done a lot of work in that space. So I think a lot of those jobs would be taken up by robots as well. So that's great. I mean, for all of us, because then there's more production, cheaper production. And then, yeah, I mean, it's good for the planet, good for all of us.
Yeah, I think one of the advantages of automation that people don't normally think about is from the quality side. In my research back when I wrote for PV Magazine, talking to companies that had moved to automation, lower defect rates. Robots are good at doing. They're not necessarily good at doing things better than humans, but they're good at doing things the same way every time. And that's something that humans struggle with more. So if you can manage to perfect the process and you can teach the robot how to do this thing, it will do it that way. But robots don't obviate the need for people to work. Suddenly, you need people to program the robots. You need people to make the robots. You still need people to do the QC on the robots. You will have fewer people working in a factory, but you will still have people working in the factory. And there's a lot of things that we have not figured out how to automate yet. We have not managed to get robot ships to put up offshore wind turbines, or assemble them, or even weld them. So there's still, a lot of these things will get automated, but a lot of these things, the deployment of renewable energy and storage in the field is an area that's been hard to automate. So yeah, there'll be advances and we'll get better at it, but there's still just a ton of work just making this stuff happen.
As consumers, as people across the world who are not really able to contribute at scale, I mean, most of us are not power producers, most of us are not in policy. Most of us are consumers. What would you advise consumers across the world who are not necessarily working in the environmental space or the renewable energy space to do differently? I mean, should they change their pattern? Should they consume less? Because if you travel across the world, single-use plastic continues to be a problem. And this is where there has been a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue. It's been on for almost half a decade now. But if you go to, let's say, a Vietnam or a Cambodia or a Laos, you'll notice you order an iced tea, you get a plastic bottle for it, you get a straw with it, and then along with that, you get a carry case that's plastic. And that's all single use. You use it for 5 minutes, it's done. What would you advise all of us as people? What do we do differently?
I do think these things are complicated. I think that I have different advice. I think most of my advice is frankly for people in the wealthy nations, because I think the people in the wealthy nations, one, we're the problem. Let's be honest. But two, we have there are a lot of areas where we have actionable abilities to affect these patterns of consumption. One of the things that I find infuriating about plastic waste, as an American and living in New England, this incredibly wealthy place, is I often don't have control over whether or not what I get is in plastic. I basically stopped eating cheese because you can't buy cheese that's not in plastic. It's just that they don't sell it, right? I haven't found anywhere that sells it. So, okay, I can give that up, but still, I mean, how much can you give up? Eventually, so I think, having worked on the plastic pollution problem, I think that there's several angles. The first angle, and this is really more for people in the affluent nations, is to shift your consumption habits where you buy things, you consciously seek out and choose things that are not in plastic. But let's be clear, that doesn't solve the problem. That's just the baby step to get you started, right? That's more important for movement building than anything. And then the next step is to implement policies that ban disposable plastic. We banned plastic bags here. That was just the beginning. I think we may have gotten through a ban on styrofoam takeout containers this year in my state, in Rhode Island. Styrofoam is such a plague. It's such an awful, especially for something you're going to use once and throw away, and you're going to soil with food. You can't even recycle it after it's soiled. Not that anybody recycles styrofoam anyway, it's horrible stuff. So we have to work on actual policy, but I think these two things are connected, right? I think that being part of movements to shift things, and some of this is, starting with your personal consumption, but you absolutely can't stop there. You have to reach out to other people who are doing the same thing. You have to reach out to organizations. You have to become part of something bigger than yourself so that you can shift policy. Because at the end of the day, as long as these industries are using disposable plastic as their dominant form of packing things, from everything from, cheese, clothing, you name it, it all comes in some form of disposable plastic. We're not going to win by just shifting our consumption patterns. So even though I think that is important, I think it's important from the perspective of movement building so that you can get to the point where you are part of a movement where you shift policy. And it's going to take coming together with other people. You know, I have great respect, even though I work primarily in climate, I have great respect for the people, the plastic activists in places like Australia, you know, organizations like Five Gyres, you know, the people who actively work and the people who worked on the bans in the European Union, because Europe is again leading in this regard. China and India have made some significant, you know, good steps there as well. I really have to applaud India for its moving away from single-use plastics.
It's easy to pass the blame. It's easy to say that, hey, we are not responsible. We are not doing majority of the damage. We are not taking private charters. We are not taking private yachts. But I think the change has to begin somewhere, and the change begins at home. The change begins at each level. So glad to have this perspective on record. Glad that someone went out and said that, hey, you can take an EV, you can take a e-bike to your grocery, so you don't need a fancy car for doing everyday mundane tasks.
Yeah, and I think that there's often, I see all the time this false dichotomy presented between larger societal change and individual change, and change of individual lifestyles. Changing your individual lifestyle is the gateway drug to larger societal change. It's the thing, it's the baby step that gets you started. It's important. It's not important because of its cumulative effect in terms of it's important in terms of building movements and changing society. But then again, you have to work with other people. You have to be part of larger organizations. And these organizations are everywhere. They're in the developing world as well. There are people who are, you know, in India and in Vietnam who are concerned about climate, who are pushing for a more sustainable infrastructure and for a more sustainable society. That's the beauty of this now. This is global.
As we wrap up today's episode, remember, small actions lead to big change. Our choices today compound to define the world's future. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this valuable, please share it with a like-minded friend. Also, please consider leaving a comment, as that really helps other listeners to find the podcast. See you in the next episode. Till then, choose cleaner, choose better.